Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the news on Plague Tapes 110, which is, I believe, the last show. Andrew can confirm, or you can confirm that. And in a way, it's a good thing, and if it's not the last show, then it might be a bad thing.
I'm not quite sure it will be the last show.
Right.
I think apart from anything else, we might want to do a retrospective, but
We'd have to listen to all those shows again.
Yeah, exactly. So where we are at the moment is more or less as we've been talking in the last few shows. You know, the sort of end of the emergency period, possibly coming out of the pandemic over a long period after that, which could be months, perhaps even years, but one where the sort of emergency measures are increasingly unnecessary, and so things go back to something that's a bit more like normal or what they used to be. And the reason I'm being cautious around saying that is that while things are sort of okay so far, looking at what's happening in Britain or the North, they're not quite so good, you know.
Okay.
They and basically, the main difference seems to be that because we delayed opening indoor hospitality, we sort of hit a critical vaccination number with only about half the cases they have each day. Some of them are a little bit higher, and that seems to make quite a lot of difference. So they have a lot more hospitalizations and deaths, like not just double, but it's more proportionally, so it may be the case that because we've now hit a high vaccination level, today was the day that 90% of everybody over 12 was vaccinated, that will be sufficient to keep us in that kind of lower level that the health system can sort of manage. However, if instead we start to get a significant rise in cases, particularly in the age groups over 12, then that things might change and we might be in trouble. And it's just impossible at this point to actually know, because there's our vaccination rate's now one of the highest in the world, so therefore we're the first ones to kind of be exploring this. And there are a lot of unknown variables in terms of waning immunity and things like that. But so I would say we probably won't end up doing a show for a while. Yeah. But I wouldn't rule out that we'll discover in a month's time, or in 2 weeks' time, or 3 weeks' time that actually there's stuff to say, because those patterns may start to become a bit clearer.
And tell us, why did the UK? What's the key difference? Is the UK opened up without the vaccination levels that we had? I mean, how low were their vaccination levels when they opened up?
Well, this is my opinion, right? Yeah. There are other differences as well. But if you remember the debate about reopening indoor hospitality, I think the first date they had set was it the start of July or the kind of the last week in June or something?
I think they wanted to do it on because Boris was choosing dates, so I think he chose 21st of June as the liberation.
Yeah, so that's what they did.
But then it got passed.
And if you remember, we originally were to do similar around the start of July. I can't remember the exact date. Maybe it was the end of the first week in July. Yeah. And instead, we delayed that until the August bank holiday, basically, right? Yeah. So if we had gone at the start of July, we'd have opened up at the same vaccination rates as they had, and same rate as they had in the North, roughly. You know, not exactly, but pretty much the same. But instead, we waited another 3 weeks, and that was at a peak vaccine supply. So a lot of additional people, got vaccinated in those 3 weeks, which meant that we didn't get the same. We got a very significant increase in cases when we opened, but it wasn't of the same magnitude that they got. And it was more concentrated from the start in younger groups, whereas theirs was a bit more mixed. And what seems to have happened in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the South is basically, as you got to a level of vaccine that could keep the growth rate around 1, then you just kept coming out more or less on this plateau, up from it a little bit and down from it over a period now of 2 months or more. Where there are there are peaks and troughs within it, but basically you just kept going at the same rate. But we're doing it at about half the rate those were. And we have much less than half the severe consequences because of that. So that appears to be the thing. Now, so what happens with that in the longer term is unsure. Like, I'm surprised at this stage that our rate of people being hospitalised hasn't fallen.
Yeah.
I suspect part of the reason for that is that a fair amount of the hospitalisations that are happening now are not actual hospitalisations, they're people contracting COVID in hospital. So we've seen a spike in hospitalisations this week, which seems to be Letterkenny, Limerick, and I think Cork all seem to have quite significant outbreaks.
Right.
That's inevitable. If you have a lot of cases in the community, then that's going to get into hospitals. There will be hospital outbreaks, and unfortunately, that means there's going to be people already sick getting infected, so they're far more vulnerable to severe outcomes, even vaccinated or not. So that probably will remain. Just like that's going to always be a proportion of cases going forward. So that's part of the difficulty, and the understanding what's going on at the moment is harder now as well, because they're about to stop close contact testing in primary schools, which means that we'll see fewer of the cases. We won't really know how much fewer, and so that is going to make it a little bit harder to compare cases now. Well, say cases next week with cases last week in terms of outcomes. So you'd expect, for instance, that the percentage of cases that become hospitalised will actually go up, because we're not seeing all the cases.
Yeah,
so we'll
true,
see the more severe ones.
Tracing.
Yeah, so there's all that. So I would say we remain in a situation that is uncertain, but it's uncertain in a different way than if we were back in June or whatever, where the uncertainty now is kind of a much slower uncertainty,
right.
Where you're sort of going, okay, we have stability at the moment, but what will that look like this time next month? So if you go right back to the start of the pandemic, and the first of these shows, we were looking at a case doubling time every 3 to 4 days, 3 to 5 days. And at that point we're doing probably 3 or 4 shows a week almost, I think, partially because we're trying to understand this new thing for the first time, but also partially because the situation is changing at that sort of rate.
That's true. Yeah.
Whereas the point we are now, like, if you think about it, not much has now happened for since the start of July, really. There was a little peak in early July that we were worried about, but from that point on, it's just been a kind of, cases going up a bit, then they've been slowly descending, and the last week they've more or less plateaued. Right. And hospitalisations and ICUs have pretty much remained in line with, you took about 2.4% of those cases became hospitalised, and about 12% of those hospital cases were in ICU a few days later. That's running all through.
Where is that in terms of wasn't there 4 plotted outcomes by NEFIT, wasn't there?
Yeah, so using the most recent ones they did, we are actually still on all 3 measures, cases, hospitalisations and ICU, we're still below the reduced transmission curves.
Right. Okay.
But their curves all started, the less severe curves all started to descend about last week.
Yeah.
And we're not seeing a descent, so we may actually cross over those in the next week or so, and find ourselves above that reduced transmission curve.
Oh, okay. So they anticipated that we would see more of a descent in cases now.
I think all the models, I think, are kind of strange in a sense, because although they typically show them over a couple of months, the actual policies they're based off never last that long.
Yeah.
So we've had the schools opening are the obvious one, which weren't really part of the models as such, as I understand them, but it'll be interesting to follow that anyway, to see what the impacts are.
And in the UK, from reading The Guardian there yesterday, it looks like the health service is under as much pressure as it's ever been in terms of, so they're now up to over 50% of hospitals have no accident and emergency room or capacity, which is staggering, isn't it?
Yeah, and they're talking about I think the army's been deployed in the north, which is obviously always big politically, to take over some stuff like ambulances and stuff. I think the same is happening in Scotland. So yeah, there's a major crisis there. It's harder to get a good grip on the nature, how bad the crisis is in terms of healthcare in the south, partially because we've always had a crisis. So we have COVID on top of that. It certainly has to be impacting some of the hospitals quite severely locally. Those ones I've mentioned where they've had outbreaks, Letterkenny in particular, and meaning a lot of other services can't go ahead. But there's not really a lot of concrete data on that. So I think at the moment it's not the same level of problem. Yeah. Everything I see seems to say if you hit a sustained period where we've 100 or more people in ICU with COVID, then it'll become a major problem quickly enough. Yeah. And we're currently 60 something, I think, and we've 65, which is actually quite high in terms of the last 6 weeks. Yeah. But in fact, the last 6 weeks it's gone between 55 and I think we had a 71 last week for a day or two. Right. But so it's just been in quite a narrow boundary. Yeah. So again, it's not like other periods of the pandemic where you were kind of going, there's 20 in ICU this week, there's going to be 30 next week, it's going to be 50 the week after. That trajectory. We're not doing that sort of equation anymore. But you've got to reckon that's just got to be completely grinding down the people doing that work. Yeah. They've now had, as I said, all summer, that's the number of cases we have, and there's no obvious sign to it.
There's no let up. Yeah, there's no let up. Just keep going at that.
Where that goes, yeah.
So then in terms of what's the grand narrative that we're talking about now? Wasn't there like some date in October where everything opens up, like nightclubs, the whole lot?
October the 22nd, because they're also saying they'll probably end contact testing altogether around then.
Right.
It seems to be the date they're talking about. It's fairly definite in terms of nightclubs opening, and I think my reading of it is that they're treating that as the date that all the extraordinary measures come to an end on. They'll still want people to do some things like probably wearing masks on public transport, in medical settings, like in hospitals and things like that. But they'll end a lot of the kind of surveillance methods that were tracking the disease in detail. Yeah. And the logic of that can only be that at that point they think they'll have got to a level of vaccination plus infection immunity that there is no strong potential for the disease to become exponential again and to overrun health services. So therefore we don't need to pay so much attention. I think in all honesty the logic of that is actually that we are already very near that point, but you want to let it run a couple of weeks to make sure of that. Yeah. And that, I mean, it's kind of tricky because, as I said, we're seeing this consistent 2.4% of people being hospitalised. So you go, well, okay, so if we just decide cases don't matter anymore, and then instead of having 1,500 cases where we are at the moment, roughly, we have 15,000, any percentage of that being hospitalised is going to create a major problem. So you're really, you're very strongly leaning on transmission remaining at a much lower state. Now, at 90% of us were vaccinated.
The vaccination that's doing all the heavy lifting.
Yeah, 93% of adults vaccinated, maybe that's something that can work. And to an extent, the tough thing, I think, is that you kind of, what do you do? What does the end of the pandemic look like otherwise? Because it's not... Yeah. COVID is not going to simply go away. It's going to remain, and it's also not going to become harmless. It's going to remain. It's interesting at this stage because I see lots of people reporting on having got infected post-vaccination. Facebook updates mostly. Right. They're all. A lot of those people are pretty sick. Now, none of the ones I've seen have been hospitalised, but they've all basically had a pretty rough few days of it. So it sounds like bad flu type territory.
Yes.
And then we know that unvaccinated people, exactly the same lack of protection as they'd had previously. So they're going to be going to the hospital in the same rates. There's just not so many of them now. That's kind of, where we're at with it. I mean... So
can you talk to me a bit about the logic of no contact tracing for kids? Like, what's the...
I think like last week there was something like 12,000 kids out of school because they were contact traced.
Right.
And I think it's about 4% of them will come back as positive.
Right.
So basically the logic of it is that the rate of transmission in schools of asymptomatic kids is low enough that the cost of having that many out of education, is greater for them collectively than the risk of onward infection. And that's partially based off the hospitalisation rates for under 12s so the rate of cases in the last 14 days is about 1 in 700 recently. The real rate, I won't go into the details of it because the way they count that, it's more likely to be about 1 in 400, I would guess. But that's relatively low,
right.
And yeah, so the thinking is therefore like just repeatedly taking loads and loads of kids out of school, and that disruption has a higher cost to them and to society than the risk of accepting a certain level of infection moving through the schools. That's the thinking.
Does it tie in at all with the idea that the route to immunity is infection for under 12s anyway?
So I just read a thread from Philip Nolan where he was swearing blind that wasn't the plan and saying at the current rates that would take 3 to 5 years anyway.
Yes, that is a problem, alright.
Which is kind of weird because I mean, like, have you forgotten about exponential growth? Because it probably wouldn't stay at the current rate. It would probably go up. I don't know. I mean, I think, like, again, this comes this question of what do you do in the current situation. We now have Pfizer are now saying that the safety trials for 5 to 12-year-olds have been successful, shown the vaccine is safe enough to use. So they'll be going to approval to the American FDA and to the European EMA. If that gets approved, then NIAC will be making a decision maybe towards the end of this month on whether or not to recommend vaccination for 5 to 12-year-olds. So if vaccination gets recommended for 5 to 12-year-olds, well, then you have a way of most of those getting vaccinated, getting immunity the relatively easier way.
Yeah.
I say relatively in this case because the thing is the risks from infection are much lower for that age group anyway, so it's not like, if you're talking
I think
groups,
like
blah,
I have
blah,
to
blah.
say if I'm not so sure I'd be signing up for that as a parent either, because I just feel like even though it's tested, but like I mean a vaccination's tested for that age group, but like it's only tested in the last few months, and they're going to live their entire life living through COVID, so the possibility of them getting immunity through infection I think is higher, and maybe that's the better route rather than a vaccine. I mean
yeah, precisely.
It's very hard. I think you would have difficulty. I think they would have difficulty even if they approve it. I think parents will be thinking a long time before they'll be sending a 5-year-old off to get vaccinated, I think.
No, exactly. That's the thing. Now the thing is, I think if they get approval, it will be on the basis that the benefit against the risk of vaccination is high enough that it makes sense, right? And it needs to be fairly. It's not just slightly. It has to be fairly substantially. So that is the case. But there's going to be much more uncertainty around it because people will be worried about long-term stuff. Now, in reality, vaccine side effects always happen in the short term. They're not, you might have a side effect that lasts for years, but it happens relatively quickly. It's not, they don't crop up 3 years later or something,
Okay.
So that's not really a thing, but you can see why people will be much less certain. And some people will be thinking, well, maybe they won't get it or whatever, although I think everybody will. So I think that's not a runner.
Well, the figures for the 12-year-olds would seem to indicate that 90%.
So I mean, if the hospital, so the main bone of contention amongst those who feel that accepting that age group being infected, which is what the other policy would be essentially, is criminal or whatever, is concerns about long COVID. So sort of saying, sure, very few of that age group are likely to die or be hospitalised. However, some of them will be sick for quite a period of time, and that is a very complicated fight. With a loaded different research that appears to say different things. So one of the key problems with research is if you do a simple symptom check, long symptom check, right, you'll find that actually, 1 in 7 kids maybe still have symptoms at 12 weeks. But then there's some studies where what they did was they also asked kids who hadn't been infected. They did exactly the same symptom checklist. And they discovered there that actually an awful lot of kids who didn't have COVID also were reporting symptoms like fatigue or whatever else. And there's a load of reasons why that happens. Partially it's to do with the specific conditions that everybody's been under, and partially it's just like there's other things cause that anyway, and then that becomes much smaller. So like there's a very polarized set of opinions in between which of those is the more accurate picture. Is it the case that maybe long COVID is something that only affects 1 or 2% of kids? Is it 10%? And how long is long COVID, and how severe is it, and all that sort of stuff is still being thought about. And a part of the reason that's still being thought about is the actual data itself is not terribly clear, because it's quite hard.
Because it's still going on, and we know people who have got long COVID and it just continues to debilitate them. So
yeah, exactly. So that might be a reason why you'd go, okay, well then I will decide to get my kid vaccinated,
Yeah.
But what I'm driving at there is, in a sense, that it becomes much simpler if cases don't explode until that approval happens, if it happens, and then parents can make a decision one way or the other. And then once that sort of space has been created, well, then the kind of moral questions around what you do next become simpler in a way.
Yeah.
Because it looks, as I said, like COVID will continue to circulate. Therefore, everybody's going to get exposed to it. So therefore, once kids have had the opportunity of being vaccinated, you're kind of just accepting that the ones who haven't been vaccinated are going to get it, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually do much to stop that happening anymore.
Yeah.
Because it will happen, and for everything we know, it's easier the younger it gets. It doesn't do you any favours if you avoid it from 5 until you're 80, for instance. So like that's the kind of, I think, the period we're going into. That's why I'm saying maybe we'll get more evidence one way or the other, and we'll want to come back and talk about that at a later date. But it's certainly that becomes simpler if they can delay any significant spread until people have had a chance to be vaccinated.
That's what they're claiming. That's what they're claiming their policy is.
They're not even claiming. I mean, I don't know if it's a reflection of internal divisions or just the fact that they're kind of, like, in a sense, so I'm using the word accepting infection there rather than, like, the what's happening in Britain seems much more that they're going, well, we'll seek to get the kids infected. There's been all sorts of stuff like that.
The removal of the face masks.
Exactly.
Was an indication that that's where they were going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, I think they have a very clear policy that in order to build population immunity, we're going to get the kids infected, and we will remove all measures that are designed to reduce that. So. Like, I've seen lots of anecdotal stories about that. Whereas here, it seems to be more that the risk of the loss of education is the greater of the two threats, but we'll still try and slow down the rate of infection to an extent, but now not to the point that that's going to cause a lot of disruption, right? Yeah. So therefore, we're not going to do contact tracing in the schools.
Yeah.
Like if symptomatic, yes, but not asymptomatic. So that's kind of where they are with the balancing those two.
That's about as clear as we can expect of any
strategy, and it's kind of like there are, like, once you accept that COVID is going to be endemic and it's going to continue to circulate, there are no good decisions there. Any of the decisions are kind of a bit crap. And it's kind of like you're trying to do a balance of what the least crap are. I'm kind of the opinion that they're actually doing a reasonable job of that at the moment.
Yeah.
But I can understand why lots of people don't feel that, because there are consequences. I mean, as I've said before, the thing is, even if the consequences to the kids themselves are not great, some of them will end up infecting parents and grandparents.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then the other side of that is if you're isolating close contact kids consistently, well, that means that their parents are going to have to take time off work. They're not entitled to sick pay, so particularly if you're in a low paid job, that means you're going to have to. You're just not going to have an income for a period. You maybe you'd even put your job under threat.
Yeah.
So there's all that happening as well. So, like, the morality of what you do becomes much more complicated as COVID becomes more like the flu.
Yeah.
So, it's a bit like all those arguments of a year and a half ago. Well, vaccination means COVID is now approaching something like a nasty flu. So a lot of the rubbish that the kind of denialists were spouting back then now actually has something to it, because vaccination has transformed that. And to me, I think I've been saying for at least this time last year and probably a little bit before that the whole goal of the measures was to create the time that vaccines could be developed and deployed in. That was the point. We weren't going to reach that point. We weren't going to lock down forever. That wouldn't have made any particular sense, and that's the point we've kind of got to. So what else could you delay for better vaccines? Maybe, I mean, enough vaccine supplies so that you can give everybody a booster every 3 months or every 6 months or whatever might be required to keep the level of infection down. I mean, like, lots of people would be unhappy with that as well. So yeah, we've got to kind of a messy endpoint where it's not like there's a single neat package you can draw up and that everybody will go, great, that's exactly what I want, happy ever after.
It's gonna it was inevitably kind of get to a kind of whimpering out stage, which seems to where we got to. But there's two questions I wanted to ask arising out of that. One is, have we got a percentage now in terms of the denialists? Like, we should know. 90%, is it over 90% of the adult population now?
Yeah, I think the last figure I saw earlier this week was actually 92.9% of adults had now got dose 1.
Okay.
So that gives you maximum denialist 7.1% or whatever.
Right, but and are we? Is that could you take another couple of percentage out in terms of like hard to access people, or like or maybe people who I don't know if is it a whole 7%? I'm just wondering if we could.
I think so. Well, for instance, so what's going to happen this week is there's a big drive to reach college students, because the colleges they have been returning over the last couple of weeks. I think first years will come back this week. So they almost all of them seem to be running vaccination programs.
Oh, I see.
So if I mean, like, I roughly for that age group, it's something like 80% have been vaccinated. Like, it's the least vaccinated by far age group, apart from the under 15s. So it could well be that if each of the colleges has a walk-in vaccine setup, I know Maynooth, I've seen figures, they're going to have one for 2 days and it can do 700 a day. And in theory, if they've 80% of those students, 20% aren't vaccinated, that might be 2,000. So you might get 1,400 of them that way. So that could push it up another bit. Right. And the thing is, like, there are only 420,000 eligible people unvaccinated now. So that's people over the age of 12. So actually, if you did 20,000 of them that way, that would be 5% of that remaining group. So it doesn't even need to be huge numbers in order to cut important sections out of that again. I also think probably because there's been two quite high profile story of kind of hard right politicians who've died recently from COVID, who were denialists. One guy in the DUP in the north, and one guy in the south. The guy who was taken out of hospital, he was because they wanted to intubate him, died at the weekend. He'd previously been a candidate for Direct Democracy Ireland, which was Ben Gilroy's lot. So that they were both kind of COVID isn't a real threat people who kind of posted that sort of stuff. They caught up with them, unfortunately. Died. We've seen that happening a lot in the States. It could be that is going to mean that some of the less hardcore people around that, particularly the ones that are more vulnerable, shift and decide they will get vaccinated. So we may see some of that picking up. There's also COVID is ripping through some of the communities that are more suspicious about vaccination as well. So that may have an impact too, in terms of, there's things like that. Like, I think the whole strategy of making it easy to access and,
walk-in clinics,
walk-ins and all that, it might mean we'll continue to see a reasonable trickle of people. What we've been seeing over the last week, basically each day, is say 1,500 to 2,000 people going into dose 1. So that's about 0.5% of the remaining eligible population. It's running at about 3.5%, 4% each week, which is a chunk. It's like a chunk out of it. Like it's not like we're going to reach all of them, but it could be there's still a reasonable number of them to come back in. Plus, this week, I think we'll see the start of booster doses for people who are particularly vulnerable being rolled out, and that'll happen over the next 5 weeks. So that's going to happen as well. So I don't think they're going to wind up the vaccination, most of what's possible in terms of vaccination, for a few weeks yet.
Right.
But obviously they won't keep all the centres open forever. That wouldn't make any sense either.
And then, do you think that the way that this has been handled in terms of, because we've mostly, when it was being handled by NEFID, it was mostly dealt with by dealing with data, numbers, information, and that's not really the way that politics works in this country. So normally we don't have civic debates about anything. We're pretty much kept in the dark, and we don't discuss issues. And then suddenly we might get a referendum out of it once every 20 years about something major, but there's no discussion about it. Do you think that the way that we've gone through this will cause some sort of cultural change in terms of the way that we deal with big civic issues, or are we just gonna is there any indications about that's gonna be that it's going to have an impact in terms
we should have an effort for housing, basically, or something.
Well, yeah, I mean, any of these questions, I mean, how does homelessness get started, and who's the best at all the data, and have a debate about it?
I don't think we will, because I mean, the nature of this emergency was such that the politicians were quite willing to hand over decision-making power, and a large section of the capitalist class were as well. But there was a large section lobbying against all that, and the restaurants and all the bullshit we've kind of seen through it. But there's no way you'd get that for housing. I mean, it just wouldn't actually happen. That wouldn't. I mean,
but also we saw that moment where it switched back into their hands, even for the briefest moment, which was the whole opening at Christmas. We saw what that happened, what that resulted in. So yeah, but my point would be that it would be great to see other massive issues being dealt with and discussed in a.
I guess, I mean, but also it's not necessarily something you would want, right? Because I mean, effectively, what was done was that, not decision-making power as such, but an awful lot of the motor that drove decision-making was taken and handed over to an unelected group of 50-odd people, and in the context of the emergency that was being faced, that was a necessary step. I don't particularly have an issue with it, but you wouldn't really want to have decisions being made in that way on most things, like that. I mean, essentially it's a wartime step was what was done, and at times in society that's the sort of thing that you end up needing to do, but you wouldn't want to have that become your routine decision making just because you're relatively happy with the set of decisions that happen to be made in this one particular case, because who knows. So I mean, you're caught up with the general problem of decision making in general there, and the balance between experts and political opinion, and who makes the decisions, and what sort of control we have over them, and all the rest. But
there's I've heard that in Holland they're trying to set up a sort of panel of experts that make decisions on a longer term basis, because they recognize that the inability of social democracy to make longer term decisions over a 20-year period, so that it can't be based on just the populist rhetoric and nonsense that they come out with all the time. But
I mean, I think
there's something to be said about actually making decisions based on facts and information, which doesn't really appear to be on the agenda from our political classes.
I guess so. I think the problem there is more to do with the way capitalism can't really trade off short-term profit for long-term being sensible. So I'm also seeing this in terms of climate change, where it's really obvious we're heading towards a disaster really fast, and they just, the agreements they make are feeble and they're unable to actually do it. And that's because in order to make an effective agreement, you'd have to decide to sacrifice the profit interests of particularly the oil companies, but a whole range of things. You'd have to go, okay, for a period of time we're going to make less money because we need to achieve this thing in the long run. And the system really can't actually do that.
Nobody can say stop.
And the problem isn't really the politicians as such. It's more systematic than that. So having you could have a panel of experts in exactly the same way who would give a particular set of advice about what needed to be done. But I think we just get Christmas at that, because outside of the immediate threat of loads of people dying straight away, those longer term things would just be ignored anyway. Like, it's not I don't think you can fix the problems we have with the way decisions are made through that sort of expert panel type thing.
Okay, here's another question for you then. What about the like you mentioned some people getting maybe possibly a third dose, and is there any discussion about what's going to happen on a global level in terms
there is. No, and that's part of the decision making in it. I think I've said this a few times. I really don't think the solution to the global shortage of vaccination is to imagine that you can somehow get the wealthy countries to ration vaccination. Just historically, that's never the way it's worked out. It's like there's a kind of moral language that it kind of fits into, but I don't think that would hold. And from what we've
moral
seen, it
language
hasn't.
doesn't seem to apply to capitalism anyway.
Like the problem is supply, really. And the fix to that problem is to open up the patents so that manufacturing can happen in multiple locations around the world. And that, I think, is what I would be much, if I was trying to change this, if there was mechanisms for doing it, I'd be much more focused on that than the idea of saying, well, no, we should hold off vaccinating under 12.
I think the states are talking about that. I mean, Biden's definitely been talking about I don't know how much success he's going to meet with.
I suspect what will happen is that with AstraZeneca, an awful lot of the AstraZeneca vaccines are produced by the Serum Institute in India. After the Delta wave hit India, India's had a big focus on vaccinating its own population, and I think it's up at 60% at the moment.
Right.
So there's probably going to be a lot of supply of AstraZeneca is going to come online in 2 to 3 months as India completes most of that process and then is looking for export markets.
Right.
China has been doing exactly the same, so I suspect there will also be a lot of export supply coming from China, and then there'll be whatever the West doesn't want for itself.
Right.
So I think that's the grim reality of this, is that what gets left over will start to get allocated, often as a way of buying political favours from countries. So what's already been distributed tends to be to part of it is about whether it's China trying to influence people, whether it's the United States trying to influence people. That's already partially what the story is. We'll see an expansion of that. And of course the other thing that's happening is Delta's ripping through a lot of global South countries anyway, so that in a way that by the point enough vaccine is available, it's not going to make that huge of a difference.
Right.
Because it's already, it's kind of grim reality of that. Now, that's not completely true, because most vulnerable populations will hopefully mostly manage to shelter, just as they try to do here or whatever. Right. But that's another factor in it. But yeah, I think realistically it's about supply, and about the really big failing of the pandemic is that, because if you look at the development of the mRNA vaccines, they're incredibly rapid. I mean, basically you have a team in China sequencing the virus within a couple of days of it being realised to be a serious problem. They make that sequence freely available. Literally the following day, groups all over the world start working on producing vaccines. And the first prototype vaccines are produced within a couple of weeks, I think. Really, really fast. And then there's the safety process, which I don't think you could have taken any shortcuts with. So that would have still rolled through into the autumn. But the really big failure was there was talk of this ramping up manufacture and all the rest.
Yeah.
But it didn't really happen. It did happen in a limited way, but there wasn't the equivalent of the Manhattan Project that built the American nuclear bomb, where they just went, right, we need, as soon as we know this is safe, we need to produce 18 billion doses of it within months. That's not what happened. Instead, there was this acceptance that it was going to be quite a slow process, dragging out over a long period of time, and that the countries of the global south wouldn't really be getting a look in until 2022.
Yeah, but it's kind of strange that up to a certain point in time in that chain, it was global cooperation here, and here, and then suddenly when it gets to the markets, it gets divided up, and then it becomes profit motive reinserts itself in there, which is really sad. But like, it's just indicative of the problems that it has. You were talking about the moral language, but doesn't seem to apply. It doesn't seem to be. It's not interpreted within capitalism. It just seems to break down at a certain point in time. Okay, well, I think that's pretty much it then. It's a wrap. Yeah, we'll come back and we'll look at it. Things.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about is we need to be looking at other things, because I think now as we emerge, I'm hoping that people are going to start, because of the issues like climate change and everything else, that people are going to become very active and aware in terms of that they're going to have to be part of the solution. They can't leave it into the hands of those that don't want to make hard decisions, or when they do make hard decisions, they make such an unholy mess of them that we're left to clean it up. So like, this solidarity that has got people through this hopefully can be applied to other issues. That's surely going to be what we're going to be seeing.
You'd hope so. I mean, as I said,
so,
climate change is definitely one of
seems to be the one,
more glaringly obvious ones, but
yeah. So hopefully we'll be reporting on some of those things as well. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.